So in addition to the calories in, calories out model, there's this idea in kind of the alternative health, paleo, low carb, keto community, carnivore community, that insulin is the main factor in obesity. And so it's called the carb insulin model, where the idea is that when you eat carbs, they stimulate insulin, and insulin is an anabolic hormone, which means that it leads to like creating structure as opposed to breaking it down, which is a catabolic effect would break things down. So the idea being that when you eat a lot of carbs, it increases insulin, and that causes things to be stored in the fat tissue. And so because of that, the solution is just not to eat carbs. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, but there's a lot of issues with this theory. So one is just that there are very clear studies, like metabolic ward studies, that show that in a high carb diet versus a low carb diet, as far as weight loss goes, the higher carb diet maintains muscle mass better, fat-free mass better, and has higher levels of insulin and has lower amounts of fat burning, yet loses more body fat.
It has increased insulin sensitivity.
Right. And has increased insulin sensitivity. Whereas the high
Like
fat, low.
significantly increased insulin sensitivity compared to a high fat diet where you are literally insulin insensitive.
Exactly. Yeah. Which we'll get to as well, because if you're insulin sensitive, then you also don't have that much insulin. You know, it's not this idea that carbs keep going up and insulin keeps going up, because as your insulin sensitivity increases, you have less insulin being produced for the same amount of carbs. So, but yeah, I mean, even before that, in these studies, they've shown that then the higher fat, low carb diet, there's less insulin, there's way more fat oxidation, way more fat burning going on, and yet they don't lose as much body fat, which just, that as a whole completely negates the carb insulin theory. And the reason for that is because it's not just a matter of burning fat, and B, there's a lot of other factors here that are going on outside of insulin. So as far as the fat burning side, what we really need to be looking at is not just the amount of burning of fat, but also the amount of storage of fat. And so the more fat that we're eating and the more fatty acids that are circulating, the more fat that ends up getting stored as well. So we have to look at that as kind of a if we wanted to create an equation or something out of that, it's quite literally fat storage versus fat release. And so in these higher fat, lower carb studies, there's more fat oxidation, there's more fat burning, but there's also a lot more fat storage, even though there's less insulin. And that's because, yes, insulin does drive carbohydrates into tissues and amino acids as well, or at least help the cells. You know, it allows the cells to take up carbohydrates and amino acids. But that doesn't mean that it's all going to body fat, because all the tissues in our bodies are using these carbohydrates. So just because you have higher insulin does not mean that you have higher fat storage, because especially if you have higher insulin sensitivity, which happens when you're eating more carbs, then more of your body is using carbs as a fuel source, assuming that everything is, you know, metabolically is functioning properly. And so you don't have anywhere near as much fat storage, or storage of the carbohydrates as fat.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is important to talk about is on the lower carbohydrate diets, there's a negative impact on metabolism in general. I mean, and you can see that and it's not necessarily measured directly by the metabolic measures they talk about in studies where a number of calories consumed and things like that. But you can see it more so in lowered androgen production, and you can see that in a lot of people in the low carb communities. And the other thing you can see in the low carb communities is terrible thyroid function and extremely high cholesterol levels in the blood. And it's not necessarily from eating higher amounts of cholesterol. That's due from a decreased conversion of cholesterol to steroid hormones and things like that, and then an elevated cholesterol production by liver and things like that. So it's not. There's a lot. Again, there's a lot going on with that, changing the macronutrient ratios and things like that are signals to the body and have different metabolic effects. So
yeah, and
that further proves the point. It further shows the importance of looking at things not purely from calories, but like, okay, here we're showing macros, and then you can go into the different effects of the different types of macros. And then for this theory in general, just from personal experience, we both we both did a low carb, very high fat diet for a while. We both were doing, well, you were doing more keto than I was. I was eating a lot of protein. But when I went over to a very high carb, very low fat diet, my insulin sensitivity on blood tests was great. My HbA1c was below hemoglobin A1c, which is a measure of glycation of the hemoglobin molecules, and it's used to look at insulin resistance to some extent or high blood sugar over an extended period of time with diabetics. And even though I was having like 400 or 500 grams of carbs a day on a low fat diet, my hemoglobin A1c was below the reference range. So there's the idea of you just eat more carbs, then you have more insulin, and then all of a sudden you're just going to get bad. I don't see that in practice. I haven't seen that in practice. I haven't seen that with other people either. What I can say though is depending on what carbs you eat and depending on what foods you eat, you can have different effects from those foods, and it's not necessarily the carbs. And I think a lot of where the insulin stuff causes all these issues comes from is in studies where they look at people who have metabolic syndrome and they have elevated insulin levels, and they're insulin resistant and things like that. And I don't think that that's because they're necessarily eating carbs.
No, it's not.
I mean, I think it's because they have a metabolic issue going on, and some things that can affect, like for example, things that cause the features of metabolic syndrome include elevated cortisol, elevated endotoxin, and polyunsaturated fats, which all three of those induce insulin resistance. They increase insulin, they increase blood, with the exception of PUFAs, they increase blood lipids. So endotoxin will increase triglycerides and cholesterol, and then cortisol will do the same. So I think it's important to really look at, what is actually inducing the insulin in the insulin resistance. I don't think it's a blatant, it's just carbs. The other thing they like to blame it on is sugar and things like that. When you look at consumptions of sugar over periods of time, like the consumption hasn't really increased that much. There have been things that have increased, and that includes polyunsaturated fatty acids to an extremely large extent, which directly induce can cause an insulin resistance or damage to the cells in general. So I think it's more important to look at that and just say, and metabolic syndrome has elevated insulin, and carbs increase insulin, so therefore you shouldn't eat carbs. Like it's a very loosely constructed argument. And then obviously the downregulation of receptors that we were talking off air earlier is like, the theory is ridiculous in and of itself, where it's just you have way too much insulin present, so therefore the cellular insulin receptors get downregulated. It's like, okay, why would, maybe for a short period of time, maybe for that meal.
Right. So we've talked about pretty extensively why insulin resistance is not caused by too many carbs or by too much insulin, and what actually does cause it, which is really inhibited glucose oxidation, which just means that our cells are not effectively converting the carbs we're eating to energy. And that's not because of too much insulin. It's not because of too much carbs. You had mentioned a few of the possibilities that could be causing it, like endotoxin, which is a metabolic toxin produced from our guts, or polyunsaturated fats. We've talked about all those things pretty extensively. So I'm just going to link to the podcast where we've talked about those and articles and things.
And there's some studies that we can put in the
show notes.
The show notes.
Yeah. And so that's just, it's helpful just to kind of mention that as far as the whole carb insulin theory, and there's studies dealing specifically with that too. So I'll link to those.